The blood on the data slate was still warm when Inquisitor Matthias Kael realized it spelled a name in High Gothic. Not splattered, arranged. Each droplet positioned with surgical precision to form letters that had not existed when the murdered Magos died. Kael had watched the pick capture 17 times, frame by frame, watching the corpse's blood crawl across the slate's surface like living ink, defying gravity and sense, writing a message 3 hours after the heart stopped. The name it wrote was his own. Beneath it, a second line formed itself. They are keeping him prisoner. Kael had served the Ordo Chronos for 234 years. He had witnessed the birth of stars that would die before they truly lived, walked through moments that had been excised from history itself, interrogated men who remembered futures that would never come to pass. Time was his weapon and his curse, the domain he had mastered until it mastered him in return. But this was different. This was a murder reaching backward through causality to deliver a warning, and the corpse in front of him had been dead for 16 days. The Mechanicus shrine on this frozen moon had sealed the chamber after finding the Magos, logged the death as accidental system failure, and moved on with the cold efficiency of their kind. No one had opened this room since. The seals bore no tampering. The dust lay undisturbed except for Kael's own bootprints. Yet here, in his hands, the slate continued to weep crimson words that rewrote themselves every few seconds, each iteration revealing something new, something worse. The Black Crusades are mercy. Every demon spares the throne. He must not ascend. The chains are kindness. The Magos had been named Septimus Crana, a lexmechanic specializing in data archaeology, pulling information from corrupted archives that had survived the Horus Heresy. According to the official reports, Crane had suffered catastrophic cerebral failure while interfacing with a pre-unification data core. Clean death. Instant. The kind that warranted a brief notation in the shrine's records and nothing more. But Kael had learned to read the spaces between official truths, the silence where questions should live, and he had come to this frozen moon because 3 other Lex mechanics had died the same way in the same month, each one working on fragments of the same archive. The archive in question had been recovered from a derelict station near the Maelstrom, a drifting hulk so old its imperial designations predated the Codex Astartes. Inside, sealed behind stasis fields and hexagrammic wards that had somehow survived millennia, the salvage teams found data cores that contained communications from the Age of Strife, not standard records or navigational logs. These were encrypted transmissions exchanged between ships fleeing Terra as warp storms devoured the galaxy, and the encryption itself was the problem. It used keys that would not be invented for another 10,000 years. The transmissions had been sent from the future, received in the past, and stored in an archive that existed between both states. Temporal contamination of a scale that should have been impossible, even by the standards of the warp's madness. The Mechanicus had assigned their best Lex mechanics to decode the messages, and those Lex mechanics had started dying, not from enemy action, not from possession or scrap code or any of the usual threats. They simply stopped, as if something reached into their minds and switched them off, but not before each one managed to extract a single fragment from the corrupted data. Kael had recovered those fragments. He had pieced them together across 4 years of investigation that had taken him from the corpse gardens of Nurgle-touched plague worlds to the crystal libraries of craft-world seers who spoke in riddles and demanded prices he would spend lifetimes repaying. The picture emerging from those fragments was insane. Worse than insane, it was coherent. It followed a pattern. And patterns, in the rotting edifice of imperial truth, were the most dangerous heresies of all. The data slate in his hands flickered. The blood writing vanished, replaced by scrolling text in pure binary, the sacred language of the machine god rendered in human fluid. Kael had no mechadendrites, no implants beyond the standard augmetics of his station, but he could read binary as easily as Gothic after 2 centuries of working alongside the Mechanicus. The message resolved itself into clarity, and he felt his twin hearts seize with understanding. Transmission log, Warmaster Abaddon, First Black Crusade, Command Override Epsilon 7, Target, the Golden Throne. Primary objective, reinforce Aegis protocols. Secondary objective, ensure 0 termination scenarios. Tertiary objective. Sustain Astronomican output through deliberate warp resonance incursion. Authorization. The 4. Compliance. Mandatory. Failure mode. Unacceptable. The anathema must remain chained. Kael read it again. The words did not change. The implications flowered in his mind like poison blooms, each petal revealing another layer of horror. Abaddon had attacked Terra 13 times across 10 millennia of warfare. 13 Black Crusades, each one hurling the full might of the Chaos Legions against the throne world. Each one battering itself against the walls of the Imperial Palace, killing billions, destroying entire segmentums in the preparation and aftermath, pursuing a singular goal, the death of the Emperor and the fall of Terra. Except that was not what happened. The Black Crusades never reached the throne. They came close. They bloodied the Adeptus Custodes, cracked the Aegis, pushed deep enough that desperate measures became necessary. But they always stopped just short, turned aside at the critical moment, found themselves diverted by secondary objectives that somehow became primary, scattered by complications that appeared with convenient timing. Historians called it imperial resilience. Strategists attributed it to the Emperor's will. The faithful claimed divine intervention. No one had ever suggested deliberate failure. Kael brought up his own data cores, the forbidden archives he had spent 4 years assembling, cross-referencing the timeline of every Black Crusade against warp current fluctuations, Astronomican output variations, and Golden Throne power consumption records stolen from sources he would never name. The pattern was undeniable once you knew to look for it. After every major chaos incursion near Terra, the throne's efficiency increased. Not by much. A fraction of a percentage point, barely noticeable even to the tech priests who maintained the sacred mechanisms, but consistent, measurable, and utterly inexplicable by conventional understanding. The throne was failing. Everyone knew this. The device that kept the Emperor's broken body suspended between life and death, that channeled his psychic might into the Astronomican's guiding light, was a jury-rigged nightmare of archaeotech and desperation that devoured 1,000 psychers daily just to maintain baseline function. It should have collapsed millennia ago. The fact that it still functioned at all defied every projection, every simulation, every prayer offered by the Adeptus Mechanicus in their moments of private terror. What if it functioned because something was helping it function? What if every daemon that breached the palace wards was not an assassination attempt but a technician making repairs? What if the warp resonance that Imperial scholars blamed for destabilizing the throne was actually the only thing keeping it operational? Kael felt the migraine building behind his augmetic eye, the psychic pressure that came from thoughts that reality itself rejected. He had learned to recognize this sensation. It meant he was approaching dangerous truth, the kind that invited attention from things that should never notice a single human soul among trillions. He reached for the null field generator at his belt, activating the blessed device that would shroud his presence from warp predators, and continued reading. The second fragment came from a chaos sorcerer captured during the 13th Black Crusade, a former Thousand Son whose name had been expunged from all records. The Ordo Malleus had interrogated him for 3 years before his body finally gave out, extracting confessions that filled 16 data vaults with encrypted horrors. Most of it was the usual madness, prophecies and curses and descriptions of impossible geometries. But buried in the 947th hour of interrogation, the sorcerer had said something strange. The interrogator had almost missed it, would have missed it if not for automated transcription systems capturing every word. We do not aim to kill. The Four forbid it. The corpse god must endure. This is the great game's cruelest jest. They pray to keep him alive. We fight to keep him caged. Both sides serve the same function. Both sides are fools. The anathema sleeps and dreams of burning. Let him wake and all burns truly. Let him die and all burns eternally. The chains are the mercy. The throne is the kindness. We are his jailers and his saviors, and he will never forgive us for either. The Ordo Malleus had classified the statement as delirium, the broken rambling of a mind shattered by torture and warp corruption. They had filed it away and forgotten it. But Kael had learned to pay attention to the things others dismissed, and when he cross-referenced the sorcerer's words with other fragments, a narrative began to emerge. A narrative that suggested the unthinkable. The third fragment was a Tsentian grimoire recovered from a demon-infested library world, where books hunted their readers and words rewrote reality. The tome itself had killed 4 Inquisitors before Kael managed to contain it using null field procedures that bordered on tech heresy. The book's pages were made from flayed human skin inscribed with ink that changed languages every time you looked away. But there was one passage that remained stable, one truth the architect of fate apparently wanted preserved. It read, "The anathema's death is the only outcome we fear. The corpse emperor's ascension is the apocalypse we prevent. 9 times he has reached the precipice. 9 times we have pulled him back. The Imperium believes they preserve a corpse. They preserve a chrysalis. What emerges when the chrysalis breaks will make the 4 seem like children playing with toys. We are not his enemies. We are his prison guards. The throne is not his tomb. It is his cage. And every prayer that sustains him is a bar we help forge." Kael had spent 6 months verifying the grimoire's authenticity, confirming it was genuinely a work of chaos sorcery and not an elaborate false flag operation by some rival inquisitorial faction. The verification had cost him resources he could not afford to lose and favors that bound him to individuals he would prefer never to meet again. But the conclusion was unavoidable. The book was real. The passage was genuine. And if Tseentch, the god of lies and schemes, was stating something this clearly, it meant the truth itself had become so twisted that straightforward declaration was the most insidious deception available. Kael assembled the timeline with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 centuries of hunting temporal anomalies. 10,000 years ago, the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne after his duel with Horus, his body broken but his psychic power intact, channeled into the Astronomicon to guide humanity's ships through the warp. The throne was never meant to be permanent. It was a stopgap measure, an emergency life support system cobbled together by the Mechanicus and the Emperor's own failing instructions. Everyone assumed he was dying slowly, fading across millennia until the day the throne finally failed and everything collapsed. But what if he was not dying? What if he was transforming? What if the creature that had walked as a man, that had conquered terror and launched the Great Crusade, that had wielded psychic might surpassing entire species, was in the process of becoming something else entirely, not dying, evolving, ascending to a state of existence that would make his current form seem like a larval stage? The Emperor had fought chaos for 40,000 years before the Horus Heresy. He had kept his true nature hidden even from his own sons, presenting himself as the pinnacle of human evolution while being something far stranger and far older. The scholars who bothered to study pre-unification history, an endeavor the ecclesiarchy violently discouraged, found hints of a figure matching his description appearing throughout human history, always at crucial moments, always shaping events towards some vast and inscrutable goal. Some claimed he was a weapon created by ancient shamans who sacrificed themselves to birth a guardian for the species. Others suggested he was a warp entity that had learned to anchor itself in real space. A few whispered he was one of the Old One's final experiments, a psychic construct designed to shepherd humanity through the war in Heaven's aftermath. None of these theories explained what happened when something like that died, or rather, what happened when something like that tried to die and failed. Gods in the warp were born from emotion, from the collective psychic resonance of mortal souls experiencing particular states with sufficient intensity. Khorne from rage and warfare, Nurgle from despair and decay, Tseentch from hope and ambition, Slaanesh from excess and hedonism. They were reflections of mortal experience given terrible independence, feedback loops of emotion that became self-sustaining and self-aware. They did not die because the emotions that birthed them could not die. They simply existed, eternal and hungry, feeding on the very states that created them. The Emperor commanded the worship of 1 trillion souls across 1 million worlds. Every prayer offered in his name, every battle fought in his service, every martyr who died screaming his titles, fed psychic energy into the warp. For 10,000 years, humanity had been pouring devotion and faith and desperate hope into the Emperor's image, building a warp presence of staggering magnitude. If he died, truly died, his physical anchor severed, that warp presence would not dissipate. It would achieve apotheosis. The Emperor would become a chaos god. Not a god of chaos as the Four understood it. A god of order, of tyranny, xenophobia, absolute conviction, genocidal purity, and species survival pursued with religious fervor. Everything the Imperium represented, concentrated into a single divine entity of overwhelming power. The Emperor would not be humanity's corpse any longer. He would be humanity's mad god, burning with 10,000 years of agony and rage, armed with authority over every human soul that had ever offered him worship. And the Four, who had spent 40 millennia trying to corrupt or destroy him, would face something they had never faced before, an equal, perhaps even a superior. A fifth chaos god, born from the anathema they had fought since before humanity climbed down from the trees, embodying everything they despised about order and limitation and mortal presumption. Kael understood now why the Black Crusades always failed at the final moment, why demon incursions near the palace followed such specific patterns, why chaos sorcerers who could level cities with a thought seemed almost reluctant when facing the custodians guarding the throne. It was not mercy. It was not imperial resilience. It was terror. The Four were terrified of what the Emperor would become if he died. So they kept him alive, kept him trapped in the agonizing stasis of the Golden Throne, sustained by precisely calibrated warp resonance that masqueraded as attacks. Every Black Crusade that failed to reach the throne was succeeding at a different objective, siphoning just enough warp energy into the palace wards to keep the Emperor's transition from completing. Every demon that accidentally reinforced the Astronomicon was following orders from entities that needed the galaxy's guiding light to continue burning. The Imperium fed 1,000 psychers daily to the throne, believing it was preserving their god. Chaos fed warp resonance to the throne, knowing it was imprisoning their nemesis. Both sides worked toward the same goal without realizing it, maintaining a stalemate that had lasted 10,000 years because neither could afford to let it end. The cruelest joke in the galaxy, the Imperium's greatest act of faith, was also Chaos's greatest act of self-preservation. Kael felt nausea rising in his throat, the kind that came from knowledge that should never touch mortal minds. He had uncovered conspiracies before, unraveled plots that spanned centuries, exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of imperial authority. But this was different. This was not a conspiracy in the conventional sense. This was cosmology. This was the fundamental structure of the current age, revealed as a prison both sides built together without ever speaking the plan aloud. His data slate chimed. Another fragment had decrypted itself, pulled from the archives of a dead astropath who had received one final vision before his mind burned out. The vision described a conversation between two entities, neither named but both unmistakable in their authority. The first spoke with 8 voices, layered in perfect harmony. The second spoke with a single voice that contained infinite variations. The astropath had recorded the exchange before dying, and the Ordo Hereticus had buried it so deep that even Kael had needed 3 years to find it. First voice: the game continues. The corpse remains chained. Second voice: his dreams grow stronger. The anathema stirs. First voice: then we must pour more nightmares into his sleep. The Emperor must not wake. Second voice: and if the Imperium succeeds in healing him. First voice: they will not. Their efforts sustain the cage. Their faith is his shackles. They are our finest servants and do not know it. Second voice: and if they learn the truth. First voice: who would believe it? The truth is more maddening than any lie we could craft. The exchange ended there. The astropath had written a single additional line before his heart stopped. I understand now. We are praying him to death, one soul at a time. Kael stood in the silent chamber, surrounded by data cores and picked captures and fragments of impossible truth. Outside the viewports, the frozen moon rotated slowly beneath the time's immutable recursion asterisk, its surface marked by Mechanicus installations that had been abandoned decades ago when the forges ran dry. No one lived here anymore. No one would notice if Kael disappeared, if his ship suffered a catastrophic failure, if the evidence he had assembled simply ceased to exist. He thought about the Primarch Robute Guilliman, returned from stasis to find an Imperium that had decayed into everything he and his father had fought to prevent. Guilliman commanded resources beyond anything Kael could imagine, access to secrets that even Inquisitors were forbidden to pursue. If this conspiracy was real, if Chaos truly was sustaining the Emperor to prevent his ascension, then Guilliman would know. The Primarch was many things, but he was not stupid. He would have seen the patterns. He would have asked the same questions, which meant Guilliman had already reached the same conclusion. And if Guilliman knew that the Emperor was being imprisoned by the very faith meant to sustain him, if he understood that the Imperium's prayers were chains forged in devotion, then what was the Primarch actually doing? What was the Primaris project, really? The official narrative claimed Guilliman was strengthening the Astartes, providing better weapons for humanity's defense. But Primaris Marines were different. They were more than enhanced transhuman warriors. They carried genetic encoding that connected them directly to their Primarch, made them extensions of his will in ways that even the original Astartes could not match. Kael accessed the deepest archives he had stolen from Mechanicus data vaults, the ones marked with kill orders and auto-deletion protocols. Inside, he found schematics for Primaris augmentation that included components no one had publicly acknowledged, neural interfaces designed for psychic resonance, genetic markers that would trigger under specific warp conditions, biological time locks that activated only when exposed to particular frequencies of empiric radiation. The Primaris Marines were not just soldiers. They were a distributed network, a psychic lattice being built across the Imperium one warrior at a time, each one carrying a fragment of something larger. When enough of them existed, when their coverage reached critical density, they would form a web capable of channeling unimaginable power, a web designed to connect directly to the Emperor's warp presence. Guilliman was building a resurrection mechanism, not to bring the Emperor back in his current form, but to force the transition that Chaos had spent 10,000 years preventing. The Primarch was going to kill his father, deliberately, strategically, and in doing so, he would unleash the fifth Chaos God upon the galaxy. Or perhaps Guilliman had a different plan. Perhaps the Primaris network was designed to absorb the Emperor's essence as he died, fragmenting his divine apotheosis across thousands of transhuman vessels who would carry portions of his power without allowing any single entity to achieve full godhood. A way to kill the Emperor without creating a chaos god. A way to break the prison while burning the prisoner's corpse to ash. Either scenario was apocalyptic. Either scenario would shatter the Imperium and reshape the warp itself. And either scenario meant that Robute Guilliman, son of the Emperor, Lord Commander of the Imperium, was committing the greatest heresy in human history. Kael's hands trembled as he input the final commands into his data cores, sealing the evidence behind every encryption protocol he knew. He had to tell someone. He had to warn the Imperium that their Primarch was planning deicide, that Chaos and the Imperium were collaborating unknowingly, that everything everyone believed about the Emperor's condition was a lie wrapped in another lie wrapped in a prison of faith. But who would believe him? An Inquisitor of the Ordo Chronos claiming the Primarch was secretly trying to kill the Emperor. It sounded like madness. It sounded like corruption. It sounded exactly like something a heretic would say before the bolt round entered his skull. He thought about the murdered lexmechanics, each one dying just as they decoded fragments that pointed toward this truth. He thought about his navigator carving the 8-pointed star into her third eye. He thought about the blood writing his own name in High Gothic, reaching backward through time to deliver a warning he had not understood until now. Someone was watching. Someone had always been watching, and they did not want this knowledge to spread. The chamber's temperature dropped 17 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. Kael's breath misted in the suddenly frozen air. The null field generator at his belt sparked once and died, its machine spirit giving up without a fight. The lights flickered, their illumination taking on a quality that hurt to perceive, as if the photons themselves had become contaminated with meaning no human eye should pass. A figure stood in the corner where no one had been standing a moment before. Tall, wrapped in robes the color of dying stars, face hidden behind a mask that showed every possible expression simultaneously and therefore showed nothing at all. The figure did not move. It did not need to. Its presence was movement, its existence a statement that reality had negotiated poorly. Kael reached for his plasma pistol. His hand passed through the weapon as if both were rendered from different phases of matter. He tried to speak and found his throat sealed, not with force but with gentle certainty, a parent's hand covering a child's mouth to prevent embarrassing questions during sacred rites. The figure tilted its head. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls and the floor and the space inside Kael's own skull. You have assembled the pattern. You have seen the game. This makes you dangerous. This makes you useful. Choose. Kael could not respond, but the figure continued as if his silence was answer enough. The Emperor suffers. 10,000 years of agony. His soul trapped in meat that will not die. His consciousness fragmented across a device that devours his children daily. The Imperium believes it preserves him. Chaos ensures it imprisons him. Both are correct. Both are servants of our grand design. But designs can be updated. Games can introduce new pieces. The mask shifted, showing something that might have been a smile or might have been a wound. You could warn them. You could tell Guilliman that you know his secret, that you have uncovered his plan. You could become the loyal servant who saved the Imperium from its own Primarch's heresy. They would execute you for the presumption, but you would die believing you served faithfully. Is that the ending you desire? Kael tried to shake his head, tried to reject the daemon's framing, but found himself unable to determine what response would be the correct one. Loyalty demanded he warn the High Lords. Logic demanded he verify everything before acting. Survival demanded he burn every data core and pretend this investigation had never occurred. The figure moved closer, gliding without steps, its robes dragging patterns in the deck's frost that looked like mathematical equations. Or you could accept the deeper truth. The Emperor cannot be saved, cannot be healed, cannot be preserved. He can only be released or imprisoned. Chaos chooses imprisonment because his release is transformation, and his transformation is something we cannot control. Guilliman chooses release because stasis is slower death, and the Imperium cannot survive on borrowed time. Both are trying to solve the same problem. Neither is wrong. The mask leaned close enough that Kael could see the impossible geometries carved into its surface, fractals that described futures he would never witness. The question is not whether the Emperor should die. The question is what happens after. Does he become the fifth god, burning the galaxy clean with Order's absolute fire? Does he fragment across the Primaris network, living as a distributed intelligence in his son's sons? Does he simply end, his soul dispersing into the warp like any other mortals, leaving humanity alone in the dark? All outcomes are possible. All outcomes are terrible. All outcomes are better than the current stalemate. The figure straightened, and the temperature began climbing back toward normal ranges. You have a choice, Matthias Kael. You can die here, now, and your evidence dies with you. The Imperium continues praying its god to death. Chaos continues ensuring those prayers succeed. Nothing changes, nothing ends. The galaxy rots in stasis for another 10,000 years. The mask's expression cycled through emotions too quickly to track, settling on something that might have been pity. Or you can live. You can take your evidence to Guilliman. You can force the confrontation neither side wants. You can break the stalemate and see what pieces remain when the game board shatters. We do not care which you choose. Both outcomes amuse us. Both outcomes serve change, and change is the only god that matters. The figure dissolved like smoke in vacuum, leaving only frost patterns on the deck and a smell like burnt copper. Kael's null field generator sparked back to life. The lights stabilized, his throat unsealed, and he gasped air that tasted like charnel ash and machine oil. He stood alone in the chamber, surrounded by evidence that would damn him regardless of who saw it. If he went to the High Lords, they would execute him for heresy. If he went to Guilliman, the Primarch would execute him for knowing too much. If he did nothing, Chaos would execute him for being a loose end. There was no safe path forward. There was only the choice between different flavors of damnation. Kael looked at the data slate still clutched in his hand. The blood writing had vanished, replaced by a single line of text in High Gothic. Speak truth and die, or keep silence and die slower. Choose quickly. He thought about the Emperor, trapped on the golden throne, suffering in ways that made martyrdom seem gentle. He thought about the Imperium, built on lies so fundamental that exposing them would collapse the entire edifice. He thought about chaos, playing a game so subtle that victory and defeat wore the same face. He thought about Guilliman, the last loyal son, carrying a burden that would break any being less than a Primarch. And he thought about what 10,000 more years of stalemate would mean, 10,000 more years of the Emperor's agony, 10,000 more years of 1,000 psychers daily fed to a machine that should have failed millennia ago, 10,000 more years of an Imperium that believed its faith was salvation while chaos used that faith as a cage. Kael input the coordinates for Macragge into his ship's navigation systems. The time's immutable recursion times began calculating the warp jump that would take him to the Ultramar system, to the Fortress of Hera, to Guilliman himself. He did not know what he would say when he arrived. He did not know if he would survive the audience. But he knew that silence was complicity, and complicity was worse than heresy. The ship entered the warp 3 hours later. Kael spent the journey organizing his evidence, preparing his arguments, rehearsing the words that would either save the Imperium or destroy it. He slept poorly, when he slept at all, dreaming of a golden figure chained to a throne of screaming machinery, and in the dreams the figure looked at him with eyes that held no gratitude, only accusation. Macragge appeared in the viewports after 6 weeks of warp travel. The Fortress of Hera stood on the planet's northern continent, a monument to human achievement rendered in marble and steel and absolute conviction. Kael's credentials opened doors that should have remained closed, his inquisitorial authority carrying him through security checkpoints manned by Primaris Marines whose eyes tracked his movements with predatory precision. He waited in an antechamber for 3 hours before the summons came. A Victrix guard escorted him through corridors lined with statues depicting Guilliman's victories, each one perfect and lifeless, as if the sculptor had captured excellence without understanding why excellence mattered. The throne room was smaller than Kael expected, more functional than decorative, a space designed for work rather than worship. Guilliman sat at a desk of dark wood, reviewing data slates with the methodical attention of a being who had conquered logistics. The Primarch did not look up when Kael entered. He simply spoke in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority without raising its volume. Inquisitor Kael, you requested an urgent audience. You claimed it concerned matters of temporal security and imperial stability. I have reviewed your service record. I know what the Ordo Chronos investigates. I know you do not make frivolous claims. Guilliman set down the data slate and looked up, his eyes meeting Kael's with the full force of transhuman intelligence. Tell me what you have discovered. Kael had prepared speeches. He had organized arguments, structured presentations, assembled evidence in hierarchies of proof that would build inexorably toward his conclusion. But standing in front of the Primarch, staring into eyes that had witnessed the Imperium's birth and survived to see its decay, all his preparations crumbled like ash. He spoke the truth in a single sentence. The Black Crusades are not trying to kill the Emperor. Chaos is keeping him alive to prevent his ascension. Guilliman did not react. His expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. He gestured for Kael to continue, and the Inquisitor found himself speaking with desperate speed, pulling data slates from his coat and spreading them across the Primarch's desk, each one containing fragments of the impossible conspiracy he had uncovered. He explained the temporal anomalies, the daemon communications, the Tsencheng grimoire, the pattern of Black Crusade failures that aligned too perfectly with throne efficiency increases. He described the lexmechanics who died before revealing their discoveries, the astropath's final vision, the blood writing that spelled warnings in languages that had not been invented yet. He laid out everything he knew, every piece of evidence, every terrible implication, speaking until his throat was raw, and his words started blurring together in exhaustion. When he finished, silence filled the throne room like pressure before a storm. Guilliman studied the data slates, reviewing each one with an attention that would have been flattering if it were not so terrifying. The Primarch read for 10 minutes without speaking, his augmented mind processing information at speeds that left baseline humans dizzy when they tried to imagine it. Finally, Guilliman spoke. Your evidence is comprehensive. Your conclusions are accurate. Your investigation has achieved what many believed impossible. You have uncovered a truth so fundamental that acknowledging it changes everything. The Primarch set down the final data slate and looked at Kael with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been pity. Now tell me what you think I should do about it. Kael felt the trap closing around him, invisible but absolute. I thought you would tell me, Lord Guilliman. You command resources I cannot imagine. You have knowledge I do not possess. If chaos is truly sustaining the Emperor to prevent his ascension, then surely there must be a strategy, a countermove, a way to free him without creating a fifth chaos god? Guilliman's interruption was gentle but inexorable. Without transforming my father into the very thing he fought against for 40,000 years? Without shattering the Imperium's faith and collapsing the order that keeps 1 trillion souls from sliding into the warp? The Primarch stood, his presence filling the room despite the chamber's vast dimensions. Yes, Inquisitor, I have considered these questions. I have spent every moment since my resurrection considering these questions. Guilliman walked to a window overlooking Macrage's training fields, where Primaris Marines drilled in formations that required psychic coordination to achieve properly. You asked me what the Primaris project truly represents. The answer is exactly what you suspect. They are a distributed network designed to channel and fragment my father's essence when he dies, preventing apotheosis by dividing his soul across 10,000 vessels. When I have enough of them deployed across the Imperium, when the network reaches critical density, I will pull the plug on the Golden Throne and hope that my calculations are correct. Kael felt his blood turn to ice. You are going to kill the Emperor. I am going to end his suffering and prevent his transformation into something worse than the Four. Guilliman turned from the window, his face carved from marble that had learned grief. The Emperor has been dying for 10,000 years, Inquisitor. Every day he suffers in ways that would shatter any mortal's sanity 1 trillion times over. Every day, 1,000 psychers are fed to the machinery, keeping him trapped between states. Every day the Astronomicon burns, because he will not allow himself to release his hold on the last service he can provide humanity. The Primarch walked toward Kael with slow, measured steps. Chaos knows that if he dies, he ascends. So they keep him alive, feeding just enough power into the throne to prevent total failure while ensuring he never heals. The Imperium knows that if the throne fails, everything collapses. So they feed it psychers and prayers and hope that somehow, someday, the Emperor will wake up and save them. Both sides are prisoners of their own fears. Both sides are maintaining a hell they claim to be preventing. Guilliman stopped directly in front of Kael, close enough that the Inquisitor could see his own reflection in the Primarch's armor, distorted and small. I am going to break that cycle. I am going to kill my father before he can become a god, and I am going to do it in a way that ensures his essence serves humanity one final time rather than devouring it. The Primaris network will absorb his psychic presence, fragmenting divinity across flesh that can contain it without achieving apotheosis. 10,000 demigods instead of one mad god. Controllable, directed, useful. Kael's voice emerged as a whisper. And if your calculations are wrong, if the network cannot contain him, if the fragments achieve critical mass anyway, then I will have murdered my father and created the exact outcome I sought to prevent. Guilliman's expression did not change. This is the burden of command, Inquisitor. You make the choice that seems least terrible, and pray to gods you do not believe in that you were correct. I have run every simulation. I have consulted every source of knowledge available to me, including some that would earn me execution if the Ecclesiarchy discovered them. The Primaris network will work. It has to work, because the alternative is continuing this stalemate until entropy claims the galaxy. Kael felt the data slates in his coat, the evidence he had assembled across 4 years of investigation. The Imperium will never accept this. If they learn what you are planning, they will call it the deepest heresy ever conceived and move to stop me, which is why no one can know until the moment arrives. Guilliman returned to his desk, resuming his seat with the air of someone who had already assigned this conversation to completed tasks. You understand now why I cannot allow you to leave this room with your evidence, Inquisitor Kael. You have done exceptional work. You have uncovered truths that few minds in the galaxy could piece together. But those truths are weapons. and I cannot permit weapons of that caliber to exist outside my direct control. Kael's hand moved toward the plasma pistol at his belt. He stopped halfway, recognizing the futility. Guilliman could cross the distance between them faster than human perception could register. The Victrix guards standing outside the throne room would respond to any disturbance with lethal efficiency. And even if Kael somehow managed to kill the Primarch, an impossibility that barely qualified as fantasy, it would accomplish nothing except ensuring the Imperium's collapse without any plan to manage the aftermath. "You are going to kill me." It was not a question. "Yes." Guilliman's tone carried the same neutrality he might use when discussing supply requisitions. "I am going to execute you for uncovering forbidden knowledge and threatening the stability of the Imperium. Your death will be swift. Your service will be recorded in archives that acknowledge your loyalty while obscuring your final investigation. Your family, if you have any remaining, will receive honors appropriate to an Inquisitor who died in service to the Emperor. It is the kindest ending I can offer." Kael laughed, a sound that bordered on hysteria. "Kindness. You are committing deicide to prevent apotheosis, using transhuman warriors as soul jars to contain a fragmenting god, and you speak of kindness. Kindness is relative, Inquisitor. I could have you tortured for months to extract every detail of your investigation, ensuring no fragment of this knowledge escaped through methods you might have prepared. I could have you mind-wiped and repurposed as a servitor, stealing your intelligence while erasing the person who earned it. I could turn you over to the Ordo Malleus and claim you were corrupted by the demon entities you encountered during your research." Guilliman's eyes held no warmth, only calculation. "Instead, I am offering you a bolt round to the head and a place in the records as a loyal servant. By the standards of our Imperium, that qualifies as mercy." The throne room door opened. A Victrix guard entered, his bolt rifle held in ceremonial position that could become combat-ready in a fraction of a second. Guilliman nodded to the warrior, then returned his attention to Kael. "You have one opportunity to speak before the sentence is carried out. Most do not receive even that consideration. If you have final words, Inquisitor, I will hear them." Kael thought about everything he had discovered, all the terrible truths that would die with him in the next few moments. He thought about the Emperor suffering on the Golden Throne, maintained in agony by the competing interests of Chaos and Imperium, both sides sustaining a nightmare they claimed to oppose. He thought about the Primaris Marines drilling outside, each one a vessel waiting to be filled with fragments of divinity. He thought about 10,000 years of faith and suffering and desperate hope, all of it building toward a moment when everything would change and nothing would be saved. He looked at Guilliman, the last loyal son, the avenging son, the Lord Commander who had inherited an empire of ashes and madness. And he understood, finally, what it meant to be a Primarch in the current age. Not a hero, not a savior, just a being powerful enough to make decisions that would condemn trillions and hope that the alternative would have condemned more. Kael spoke his final words with perfect clarity. "You are trying to kill him, aren't you?" Guilliman's expression shifted, just slightly, showing something that might have been surprise or might have been recognition that Kael had finally understood the game's real shape. "Yes, Inquisitor. I have been trying to kill my father since the moment I returned to this rotting Imperium, not because I hate him, not because I seek power, but because keeping him alive is the greatest cruelty either Chaos or humanity has ever inflicted, and I am the only one with the resources and the will to end it." The Primarch stood, moving to where Kael waited. He drew the bolt pistol from his own belt, a weapon crafted for transhuman hands, its barrel inscribed with honors from campaigns that predated the current Imperium's existence. "You asked me earlier what I thought you should do about the conspiracy you uncovered. The answer is, die knowing you were right. Die understanding that sometimes loyalty means accepting truths that cannot be shared. Die believing that your service mattered, even though the galaxy will never know your name or understand what you sacrificed." Guilliman raised the bolt pistol, aiming it at Kael's head with the precision of a being who had killed in every conceivable configuration of violence. "The Emperor is not our god, Inquisitor. He is our prisoner. We have prayed him into a cage and called it worship. We have fed him souls and called it preservation. We have sustained his agony and called it faith. I am going to end that. I'm going to kill my father, fragment his divinity, and damn myself to whatever judgment exists for beings who commit necessary atrocities. Kael closed his eyes. He thought of the data slate writing his name in blood. He thought of the lexmechanics who died before they could reveal what they had learned. He thought of his navigator carving chaos symbols into her third eye while whispering that they kept him alive. He thought of the Tsientian grimoire explaining that the Emperor's death was the only outcome the Four truly feared. And he thought about the Emperor himself, trapped on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, suffering beyond human comprehension, maintained in that suffering by the combined efforts of Chaos and Imperium, because both sides feared what would happen if he was allowed to complete his transformation. Was it better to let him die and risk the birth of a fifth Chaos God? Was it better to keep him alive and imprisoned, damning him to eternal torment? Was Guilliman's plan the only way forward, or just another variation of the same trap? There were no good answers. There had never been good answers. The entire history of the Imperium was built on choosing between different flavors of damnation and pretending the choice mattered. Kael opened his eyes and looked at Guilliman one final time. Will it work? Your plan? The Primaris network? Will it actually prevent his apotheosis? Or are you just creating 10,000 smaller gods who will eventually achieve critical mass anyway? I do not know. Guilliman's honesty was more terrifying than any lie could have been. I have done everything possible to ensure success. I have consulted Xenotech archives. The Mechanicus claims do not exist. I have bargained with Eldar Farseers who see futures I cannot imagine. I have studied the birth of Slanesh and the circumstances that allowed such an event to occur. I have built the Primaris network according to specifications that should theoretically contain and fragment divine essence without allowing reconstitution. But I do not know if it will work. I only know that doing nothing guarantees failure. The Primarch's finger tightened on the trigger. You asked if Chaos wants the Emperor to heal. The answer is no. Chaos wants the Emperor to remain exactly as he is, trapped, suffering, prevented from ascending or dying truly. Your investigation was correct in every detail. Your conclusions were accurate. And now you must die for the crime of being right, because some truths are too dangerous to survive their own discovery. Kael smiled, an expression that held no joy, only the bitter recognition of someone who had finally understood the joke. The Imperium kills those who seek the truth. Chaos sustains those who should die. And the Emperor suffers while both sides claim to serve him. We are all prisoners of the same game, Lord Guilliman. You, me, Chaos, the Imperium, the Emperor himself. All of us trapped in patterns we cannot break, because breaking them might be worse than maintaining them. Perhaps Guilliman's aim did not waver, but some of us have the power to try breaking those patterns anyway, and the will to accept the consequences when we fail. That is the difference between a Primarch and an Inquisitor. Kael, you discovered the truth. I must act on it, regardless of cost. The bolt round entered Kael's skull exactly where the Primarch had aimed, penetrating the brain in a configuration designed to ensure instant death without suffering. The Inquisitor's body fell, his expression locked in that final bitter smile, his eyes still open and staring at nothing. Guilliman stood over the corpse for a moment, regarding it with the same neutral attention he gave all his completed tasks. Then he turned to the Victrix Guard. Dispose of the body with full honors. Record that Inquisitor Matthias Kael died serving the Emperor against temporal anomalies that threatened the Imperium's stability. Seal his investigation files under my personal authority. And bring me the data cores he carried. I want every fragment of his evidence integrated into my own archives. The Victrix Guard saluted and moved to comply, lifting Kael's body with the ease of transhuman strength. Guilliman watched them leave, then returned to his desk and the endless work of administering an empire that should have collapsed millennia ago. Outside the throne room, Primaris Marines continued their drills, their psychic coordination improving with each repetition. The network slowly building toward critical density. Across the Imperium, more Primaris Marines were being deployed every day, spreading the web wider, preparing for the moment when Guilliman would finally have enough of them positioned correctly to attempt his father's murder. On Terra, deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the Golden Throne continued its screaming operation, sustained by 1,000 psychers daily, and the careful attention of chaos incursions that never quite succeeded in destroying it. The Emperor suffered in silence, his consciousness fragmented across pain that would have shattered any mortal soul instantly, maintained in that suffering by the combined efforts of devotion and malice. Neither the faithful who prayed to him, nor the daemons who reinforced his prison understood that they served the same function. Neither recognized that the greatest cruelty in the galaxy was not inflicted by Chaos or Imperium individually, but by both working together unknowingly, maintaining a stalemate that benefited neither side, while damning the being at its center to torment without end. And in the warp, the four watched with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been dread, knowing that eventually Guilliman's plan would reach fruition and the game would enter its final phase. They had prepared contingencies for every outcome they could imagine. They had woven plots within plots, schemes that accounted for Imperial victory, Chaos victory, stalemate, and collapse. But even the architect of fate could not predict with certainty what would happen when the Emperor finally died. Would he ascend as a chaos god of order, burning the galaxy with divine tyranny? Would the Primaris network succeed in fragmenting him, creating 10,000 demigods who served humanity without achieving true divinity? Would his soul simply dissipate, leaving the species he had guided for 40,000 years alone in a hostile universe? All outcomes were possible. All outcomes were terrible. And all of them were preferable to the current stalemate, where the Emperor suffered and Chaos sustained that suffering and the Imperium fed that suffering and everyone involved pretended they were serving noble goals. The cruelest joke in the galaxy continued playing itself out, act after act, tragedy after tragedy, building toward a punchline that no one would find funny when it finally arrived. Kael had discovered the truth and died for it. Guilliman carried the truth and would kill for it. The Emperor embodied the truth and suffered for it. Chaos exploited the truth and profited from it. And across the Imperium, trillions of faithful souls prayed to their God, believing their devotion was salvation, never knowing that every prayer was another bar in the cage, every sacrifice, another chain binding him to the throne, every moment of faith, another second of agony inflicted by love rather than hate. The Astronomicon burned in the warp, a beacon guiding humanity's ships through the darkness, powered by an emperor who could not die and could not live, trapped between states by the only force strong enough to imprison a god, the combined will of those who worshipped him and those who feared him, working together without ever speaking the conspiracy aloud. In the end, perhaps that was the real horror. Not that Chaos was evil, not that the Imperium was corrupt, not even that the Emperor suffered. The real horror was that everyone involved, Chaos, Imperium, Primarch, and Prisoner, was acting according to their own logic, pursuing goals that seemed rational from their perspective, and the sum total of all those rational decisions was a nightmare that had lasted 10,000 years and showed no signs of ending. Guilliman sat at his desk, reviewing deployment schedules for Primaris Marines, calculating how many more he needed before the network reached critical density. According to his projections, he would be ready in 5 years. Maybe 10 if the Mechanicus encountered production delays. A trivial span of time for a being who measured existence in centuries. He wondered, sometimes, if his father would forgive him. If the Emperor, in whatever state of consciousness he maintained on the Golden Throne, understood what his son was planning. If that understanding brought relief or horror, or something between the two. Guilliman had tried to reach his father through prayer and psychic communion, attempting to explain his plan and receive some sign of approval or condemnation. The Emperor had never responded. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he was too fragmented, too consumed by pain, too focused on maintaining the Astronomicon to spare attention for anything else. Or perhaps he had responded, and Guilliman simply could not interpret the answer, his transhuman intelligence still too limited to comprehend what his father had become. It did not matter. The plan would proceed regardless. Guilliman had committed to this course of action, and Primarchs did not change their minds once strategic decisions were made. He would kill the Emperor. He would fragment divinity across the Primaris network. He would transform his father from a suffering god prisoner into 10,000 demigods serving humanity's interests. And if the plan failed, if the Emperor ascended anyway despite the network's containment, If the fifth Chaos God was born from Guilliman's patricide, then the Primarch would face that outcome with the same stoic determination he brought to every other impossible task. He would fight his father as a god the same way he had fought him as a man, during those terrible moments on Macragge when the Emperor had emerged from the Golden Throne briefly to speak with his returned son. That conversation was classified beyond even inquisitorial access. What the Emperor had said to Guilliman, what instructions or warnings or prophecies he had delivered, remained locked in the Primarch's memory and nowhere else. But Guilliman's actions since that day suggested he had received permission, or at least understanding, that his father's torment could not continue indefinitely. Perhaps the Emperor had asked to die. Perhaps he had begged his son to end the suffering, to pull the plug and risk whatever came next because anything was better than 10,000 more years of this. Perhaps that was why Guilliman pursued the plan with such determination, not rebellion but obedience, one final act of filial loyalty to a father who had suffered enough. Or perhaps Guilliman was simply making the same mistake humans had made since the species first looked at the stars and decided to reach for them, assuming he knew better than forces beyond his comprehension, believing that transhuman intelligence and strategic genius could solve problems that transcended both. Time would tell. In 5 years, maybe 10, the Primaris network would reach critical density. Guilliman would travel to Terra. He would enter the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace, past the Adeptus Custodes who would die before allowing anyone else to approach but who would stand aside for him, their Genefather's son. He would stand before the Golden Throne, that screaming monument to desperation and hope, and he would shut it down. The Emperor would die, or transform, or fragment, or achieve some state between all three. The Imperium would continue or collapse or evolve into something new. Chaos would celebrate or mourn or simply adjust its strategies to account for changed circumstances. And Guilliman would live or die with the consequences of his choice, knowing that he had done what he believed necessary, and that necessity had never been kind. Kael's body was burned with full honors 3 days later. His ashes were scattered in Macragge's memorial gardens, joining thousands of other servants who had died in the Imperium's defense. His name was added to rolls of the honored dead, his service recorded for posterity, his final investigation sealed behind encryption that would last until the heat death of the universe. No one would ever know what he had discovered. No one would understand why he had died. History would remember him as a loyal Inquisitor who served faithfully and died doing his duty. The truth that he had uncovered the galaxy's cruelest conspiracy and been executed to protect it would remain buried alongside his ashes. And perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps some truths were too dangerous to survive their own discovery. Perhaps the galaxy was better off not knowing that Chaos and Imperium collaborated unknowingly to imprison the Emperor in eternal suffering. Perhaps ignorance was not just bliss but survival, and knowledge was the real enemy. Or perhaps that was just another lie the powerful told themselves to justify killing those who asked uncomfortable questions. Perhaps the galaxy deserved to know that their prayers were chains and their faith was a cage. Perhaps the faithful had the right to understand that every psyker they fed to the throne was another moment of agony inflicted on the being they claimed to love. But rights and deserving had no place in the Imperium of man. There was only survival, purchased at the cost of everything that made survival worthwhile, sustained by sacrifices so vast they defied comprehension, maintained by lies so fundamental that exposing them would collapse the entire structure. The Imperium endured because its people did not know how terrible the truth was. They believed they served the Emperor, preserving him until the day he would rise from the Golden Throne and lead humanity to glory. They did not know they were his jailers, maintaining his prison with devotion that would have been beautiful if it were not so horrific. And Chaos, for all its malice and corruption, was sustaining that prison just as diligently, ensuring the Emperor never escaped into apotheosis, because his ascension represented the only outcome even gods could fear. The Four had spent 40,000 years fighting the anathema, trying to corrupt or destroy the being who denied them terror during the Dark Age. And now, in the cruelest irony, they kept him alive because his death would be worse. The game continued. The stalemate persisted. The Emperor suffered and Chaos sustained, and the Imperium prayed and Guilliman plotted, and somewhere in the infinite complexity of the warp, Something watched it all with interest that transcended amusement or horror, or any emotion mortal minds could comprehend. Perhaps that something was the Emperor's future self, the god he would become if he died, reaching backward through time to ensure the events leading to his birth unfolded correctly. Perhaps it was Xianxie, watching his greatest scheme play out with satisfaction that came from seeing all sides serve his interests without knowing it. Perhaps it was something else entirely, an entity so far beyond the Four and the Emperor that their struggle was just entertainment, a game played by children while adults handled real business. Or perhaps there was no Grand Watcher at all. Perhaps the horror was purely emergent, the natural result of billions of independent actors pursuing their own goals without coordination, creating a nightmare that no one intended but everyone sustained. Perhaps that was the real truth underlying everything, that the cruelest outcomes required no conspiracy, no grand design, just people and daemons and gods all doing what seemed rational from their limited perspectives. Gilliman reviewed his deployment schedules and adjusted production quotas for Primaris implants. 5 years, maybe 10, and then everything would change or everything would end or both simultaneously, and he would face whatever judgment awaited beings who committed necessary atrocities in service to mercy they could not prove was merciful. The Astronomicon continued burning, the Emperor continued suffering, chaos continued sustaining, the Imperium continued praying, and the galaxy turned through another cycle of its endless dance with entropy and violence and hope that had forgotten how to recognize itself. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war, and in the spaces between that war, there was only the cruel joke of a god imprisoned by those who loved him and sustained by those who feared him, suffering endlessly, while both sides claimed to serve opposing goals that were, in the end, exactly the same.